Welcome to the Canadian Marijuana Debate. Tonight's guests, Member of Parliament for Scarborough Rouge River, Derek Lee, University of Toronto Law Professor, Alan Young, and Executive Director of the Alcohol and Drug Recovery Association of Ontario, Jeff Wilby. And now, your host, Charles Clement.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us. In this edition of the Canadian Marijuana Debate, we'll be discussing the pros and cons associated with the prohibition, decriminalization, and legalization of marijuana.
President Roosevelt called the prohibition of alcohol the noble experiment. Still, it was an experiment that failed. During the 1920s and 30s, the black market exploded as supply continued to meet demand. Organized crime flourished and fortunes were made while thousands died or were imprisoned. 70 years later, the prohibition of marijuana is still in effect, and history repeats itself with a vengeance. Millions of dollars and man-hours are spent in law enforcement and court proceedings each year. And still, the popularity of the drug continues. Head shops, stores selling marijuana paraphernalia, literature, and legal hemp products are common in every major North American city. But the war on drugs continues in Canada and the United States, with thousands of men and women being incarcerated each year for simple possession of a relatively harmless substance. At the same time, tobacco, responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths annually, is still tolerated, and alcohol, accountable for crime, disease, accidents, and lost productivity, continues to be produced, sold, and consumed everywhere.
Here with us in the studio, I'm happy to welcome the following guests, beginning to my absolute far right, Professor Alan Young, Professor of Law at Osgoode Hall, who's also a practicing lawyer who's acted in cases dealing with both the medical and recreational use of marijuana. Thank you for joining us, Alan. To my immediate right is Mr. Jeff Wilby, the Executive Director of the Alcohol and Drug Recovery Association of Ontario. Jeff, thank you very much for joining us. We understand you've also acted as Director of the St. Leonard Society of Canada, which of course exposed you to Canada's criminal system and the people in it who've been affected by illegal drug use. So
exposed from the outside, yes.
Well, obviously be bringing along that perspective, so thank you for being with us. And sandwiched in the middle is Mr. Derek Lee, who's the Liberal Member of Parliament representing the riding of Scarborough Rouge River. Mr. Lee was also a member of the Commons Special Committee on the Non-Medical Use of Drugs. To set things up for us, I think it probably would serve us well to look at the whole spectrum with respect to this discussion. At one extreme being the current system, the status quo, which is the prohibition of marijuana. At the other extreme, of course, being the legalization of marijuana, be it under a regulated or non-regulated system. And that big space in between is known as the decriminalized system, which we'll get a chance to talk about tonight. I'd like to start by just getting a sense of where the three of you sit on this spectrum, where your preferred system might be, and we'll begin with Jeff, if you will.
Well, Charles, I think it's really important we're having this debate. I think one of the most positive aspects of this is that both the federal reports that we'll talk about here, the Senate and the House of Commons, at least they're shining a spotlight hit on one of society's challenging issues. These are complex issues in many ways. I think what I really appreciate is that there is a suggested paradigm shift to move it from just a criminal justice issue into a more balanced, also it is a more public health issue. So the very fact that we're discussing this, now I would hope that this thing does not stall, that the discussion goes on, even if I disagree with certain comments. I appreciate both those reports and we're pleased to give you some of my opinions. Just say one more thing. The only difficulty I'm going to have here is not with my two colleagues up here, is my own association, because within my own association of treatment are pretty varied kind of opinions, not so dissimilar to the general public. So, okay, it's for me then it's many things I may say are my personal opinion.
Right. So, but for the record, you would find yourself in that middle slice of that spectrum, well, decriminalized?
Let me say this: if in fact we are authentically, going to move that way, it will not. It would be a folly if we do not do as the House of Commons Committee suggested we do. We need to put money into prevention, okay, education, and we also need to have it in treatment. My understanding when they decriminalized in Holland, for example, that there was a spike. And so what we need to do is be prepared for that spike. So my comments are conditional.
Got it. Mr. Lee.
I think when they decriminalized pornography in Sweden, there was a spike too. But
Were they prepared for that?
anyway, that's not the issue. In my view, and being with the committee, and I don't speak for all of the committee, but our report is certainly public. I think most of the committee believed that in the whole scheme of things dealing with non-medical use of drugs, marijuana was truly a piker. Just not worthy of the bulk of our focus. There are bigger fish to fry in terms of drug problems. And yes, we certainly agreed it was primarily a medical. Many Canadians view it as a moral issue, others a criminal issue or a law issue, legal issue. Health is really the big one. And we got a lot of work to do in that envelope. Marijuana is a small piece of it.
So for the record, you supported, obviously, as a member of that committee, that position of being a decriminalized illegal substance.
As opposed to total legalization, yes. We felt that the current regime, which includes marijuana with all of those others prohibited drugs, all of those others, was disproportionate. The criminality attached to it and the criminal records attached to it and the processing in the criminal courts was out of proportion to any harms that we could find associated with marijuana.
Alan.
Full legalization. This decriminalization debate is a bit of a nonsense debate. It's a legal gray zone. It doesn't exist. It's simply the removal of one regime without replacing it. I have to advocate decriminalization in my legal work because it's a necessary stepping stone. Canada is not ready for legalization, nor has any Western world done so. Decriminalization to me is just a stepping stone to get us habituated to the problem, or the situation, I should say. But ultimately, it will be a legalized distribution network, and it will happen when the governments decide they want to make money from it. In the same way, suddenly, gambling became moral when the government decided they had to fill their coffers with gambling revenue. So right now, we're working on decrim, but eventually, when we start running some good deficits, we'll see legalized distribution.
I read something the other day. I wanted to get comment or reaction from on your parts, just with respect to prohibition and some of the cons, shall we say, associated with that system. There was a letter written to the United Nations and signed by some very prominent world figures, among them the former UN Secretary Javier Pérez de Cuellar, Milton Friedman, the esteemed economist, and George Shultz, the former American Secretary of State. And the letter dated June 6, 1998 was delivered to Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the United Nations. And the letter went on to state that the global war on drugs is causing more harm than drug abuse itself. What's your reaction to that, Alan?
Well, no question from my perspective. I'm a defense lawyer. I have to go to court and defend people whose only crime is they choose to intoxicate themselves in a different way. I see these people go through stress and turmoil. I see their job opportunities limited as a result. I've also seen police go in and raid grow operations with their guns drawn and put little kids on the floor with a gun to their head. That's not the way to create a civil society. So yes, I think prohibition tends to have much more negative repercussions than any possible value it has. We clearly haven't achieved much. So really, it's pretty easy to say it has more harm than good because we haven't achieved any, so the balance is a little bit skewed. I think that's a pretty fair statement.
Derek?
I would say that the corruption in some of the social dysfunction attached to or accompanying the prohibition is costly for us and unnecessarily costly. I wish it weren't so, but it just so happens that organized crime has found a place to make money, and organized crime is a way of twisting the system, of bribing institutions, undermining institutions, people. And as a result, there are real costs in prohibition, in maintaining a prohibition, and I wish they weren't there. They are. Canadians are somewhat cautious in moving the goalposts here, but so we've got to have some prohibition. At a minimum, we've got to have regulation. It seems to me alcohol got a bit of a bad rap in the 1920s, and there was prohibition. It got a bad rap. It was unnecessarily prohibited. And I think marijuana may have gotten a bit of a bad rap whenever that, you'll know, Alan.
It was all the same. It was all the same hysterical temperance.
And, you know, it is perhaps unnecessarily over-prohibited, and we've applied the same prohibition template across the board. And so we're using planes and guns and ships and radar and people,
It's costing
human
a lot
sources
of money.
and courts and police. to prohibit something that in my view does not occasion all that much harm. I'm talking marijuana only. I mean, there are more addictive drugs out there. Nicotine itself is many times more addictive than marijuana appears to be, than alcohol appears to be, and it's regulated, not prohibited. I'm talking nicotine in tobacco, and so I think we've got to make some adjustments here.
Jeff, you've seen this at the grassroots level with regards to your exposure to some of the people who are affected by the system. Do you believe it creates a worse system?
Well, I think it's unfortunately this term of you know, the war on drugs. Okay, so if the war is about guns and enforcement, okay, that's one thing, and that's what it's about, and that doesn't appear to be working very well at all. I think so. We're looking at that supply side, and I think part where I'm coming from is on the demand side. Is that I'd rather not be here talking about this particular issue, okay? I don't think it's, there's a danger here in terms of sort of saying that, that this is a sort of, you know, a non-harmless kind of situation. For the vast majority it is. Alcohol is the same way. I mean, 90% of people can enjoy a drink of wine, enjoy it with their meal, but 10% of them are going to end up in difficulty. There's that debate around whether marijuana is a gateway drug. I think you've touched on it a little bit in terms of gateway is probably cigarettes, okay, or tobacco.
The first one, what you mean is cigarettes may lead to tobacco, cigarettes may lead to marijuana.
We use the same statistical methodology. It's probably milk that starts the
milk,
whole
maybe milk, maybe milk does.
Yeah, exactly.
But I would say this, Alan, if you're drinking gallons and gallons of milk, it's pretty kind of obsessive kind of behavior. So
you touch on something interesting on the gateway, the gateway theory there.
Yeah, I mean, there's arguments in terms of does marijuana lead to harder drugs? I'm going to use the terms hard drugs. Well, I know one thing that I know the number of calls, the recent stats coming out of the Alcohol and Drug Registry of Treatment, DART here in this province, the number 3 call, and these are voluntary calls as far as I know, the number 3 is marijuana. So heading that is alcohol, which, you know, look on the graph, is very large. Alcohol, cocaine, then marijuana, right? Crack, heroin, other drugs will sort of kind of drop off. Now, I want to make, I don't know if you're aware of this, recent, about 2 months ago, there's a report out of the RAND Research Center that talked about that there are indicators to say that, that certainly marijuana, that you're at higher risk if you're ingesting marijuana to move to harder drugs. What the interesting point is that they take a look and say, but is it in the drug itself or is it in the person, okay? Is it in fact that, that there are more people able to use marijuana? I was in a high school a couple of years ago, Charles, and a young fellow just hit me right between the eyes. He said, you know, I can get grass easier than I can booze because, you know, nobody asked me for my age of majority card. From my perspective, where I come from and the people I represent who are out there on the front lines, whether it's working in prisons or working at hostels or in treatment centers, is that for those who do move on, for whatever those reasons are, we need to make sure that we've got, okay, the resources there, and I'm going to tell you right now, we don't. It's tokenism in terms of, your committee talked about public education, and if the government's serious, then indeed, okay, we need to put some bucks into it. You can't do anything in health if this is a health issue. If you want to take a picture of my belly, you know, with the MRI, they cost money. The doctors cost money. And so if we're really serious about this, I would hope before we move towards, okay, if we are moving gradually there, Alan, is that I would not want to see what we did here a few years ago on another issue, a moral issue that we looked at, or an unjust issue, when we looked and questioned as a society, should we be housing people suffering from mental illness, the large numbers, in institutions? And there were very good reasons to make those adjustments. What we didn't do was set up the resources, and what we did was cause a great deal of harm. So I'm here to suggest we don't do this.
And you do know if we do free up the system, we're talking roughly $1 billion, which we can put into the health type issues that you speak of. So the money is there if we abandon the prohibition.
Maybe a federal government's perspective, would the money be there? Do you believe that there will be a commitment from the federal government to back up these sorts of claims that have been made in these reports?
We took a broad look at the drug issue, and we had to include alcohol and tobacco. We are investing large amounts of taxpayer money in the tobacco education side. There's no reason why we shouldn't be doing the same thing on the drug side. And one thing that I noted, it has got nothing to do with prohibition or legalization or anything else. We're looking at drugs by what's on the list now. But I have a sense there's going to be a whole lot of new drugs coming on in the future. People will simply invent them, we'll find them. And so our young people primarily are going to face a future where there's all kinds of drugs, and we don't really have a choice but to try and educate them about what drugs are, what they do. Be objective. Not,
But we won't do that. We'll simply prohibit the drug based on fear.
No,
we never do the study
we've
first.
recommended that we invest, we invest in a significant way in education, not trying to scare them, but to educate young people as part of a health program what drugs are, what they do, how you become addicted, how some people have a greater propensity to be addicted.
Sure. Yep.
And teach them the facts so that when those new drugs come along, more of them will understand what's going on. They're less likely either to become addicted or to participate in illegality.
It's all about understanding responsible drug use.
Right.
See, the problem is we equate use and abuse as if they're the same concept, and they are so far apart. And what we don't do for our young people is explain to them responsible drug use. I believe, and this is a heretical thing to say, every drug can be taken responsibly, including the hard drugs. You got to be, you know, obviously more astute as you go up the scale. But we don't do that. We simply create this hysteria, tell people not to do it, just say no. They're going to do it because it's human curiosity, and they don't know how to do it responsibly. And that's what saddens me a bit about what we do.
I think you can make a point there. Okay, we know that we're going to experiment. Okay, we know that most in the marijuana, that most people are getting in their 20s or so. They may occasionally engage, but any kind of heavy use, the vast majority, we know that. But for those that get in difficulty, the point you're making is that they need to know. We also need to know, whether we're a teacher or we're a parent or what have you, that we need to get in there and intervene very early for those that get themselves in difficulty. And I think exactly that is that in terms, as you're saying, about choice, it needs to be a very informed choice. The problem is, the kids out there sometimes, some of our youth, that feel that they don't have the information. I mean, the very fact that we now are able to use marijuana, okay, medically, that I know you had a great deal to do with, and your influence there, has left the impression, okay, that this is okay. And I think that if you don't put the kind of resources in to get those messages out there, Alan, we end up, and I guess that's where I'm concerned about those that get their lives in difficulty, as you are as well, Derek.
I agree completely. And the thing is, I always think probably the most dangerous thing a young person can do is get behind the wheel of a car. So what do? We train them, we graduate them, we educate them, and still they kill people on the road, but at a lesser degree. And that's what we should be doing with drugs. Drugs, to me, are far less dangerous than cars.
One of the things that jarred us initially, early in the study, was when we went to Halifax, Nova Scotia. We found that the street drug of choice was Dilaudid and OxyContin. These are prescription drugs diverted from the medical system, not the classic, the crack cocaine, the cocaine, the heroin, the morphine. It was diversions out of the existing medical system that was the main street drug. And, so that changed the whole paradigm for us. The issue was the whole spectrum of drugs, not what the criminal code said was an illegal or prohibited drug, not the last movie you saw about the drug trade and organized crime. It was just drugs right across the board. And
Derek, I'd like to ask you, with respect to the Senate report compared with the Common Special Committee report, the Senate report essentially, to my understanding, recommends legalization, but of course with a well-funded unified national drug program which will create all kinds of programs, education, awareness, drug prevention, that sort of thing. In Chapter 9 of the Commons report, it definitely takes a step towards that direction and echoes some of the comments and the recommendations in the Senate report, but it doesn't seem to go quite as far. Would you agree with that? And if
sure.
So, why did the Commons report not take that further step?
Well, let me suggest that our senators, being unelected, had the intellectual freedom to take on an issue and do a good job. I mean, they did a good job. They did a very good job. They had more time, and actually they had more money than we did. That's okay. They did a good job, and that report is there for people to study the subject. I suppose our report was constrained more by the political realities, the art of what was doable, of where we could move the goalposts without having to create a revolution. And I mean, Alan accepts some of that too in terms of his work, and I suppose that was the constraint, that we were only prepared to recommend what we felt we could do and accomplish in the House of Commons.
So in light of that, if we're looking for political support and the public support, the readings that I've done in preparation for this debate have at least showed me that the Canadian public seems behind the concept of decriminalization. And if that's the case, then why isn't the government, moving with this? It would seem to me we'd be getting answers to this.
The answer to that is probably, I think they may be. I think it's just a question of timing.
The Canadian public has supported this for 30 years. Okay? This is a failure in democratic theory, what's happening here. This should have happened 30 years ago in the 70s. Public opinion polls have not changed much. In the 80s, it went down a little bit. It was a more repressive era. But really, politicians have not listened to the electorate. I don't know why. We can posit American intimidation. We could posit legislative inertia, a whole bunch of things. But what distresses me the most about this issue is, as you said earlier, we shouldn't be talking about this. This is an old issue, quite frankly. And it troubles me immensely that this government will not be responsive to the views of Canadians. Because it really has been close to 70% of Canadians since 1975 have wanted the law changed. There's some divergency of opinion as how they want it changed, but they don't like the current regime. And it should have changed a long time ago when the Western world was changing, Europe and Australia. We should have just moved along with it instead of looking south of the border to see whether we should get the green light or not.
I'd be very surprised if all of the work my colleagues and I put into this report, if it was disregarded by the cabinet, I'd be very surprised.
Remember, Ledane spent 4 years and millions of dollars, and I think he was pretty disappointed.
He wasn't elected. I mean, I got to tell you that this program may be re-recorded or replayed, but you know, from where we sit in time here in 2003, there's work in process, and just let's put it this way: as an elected member of the House of Commons sitting on the government side, I would not want to see my labors go to waste.
Well,
good. I'm glad to hear that.
You mentioned a good point, Alan, in that the support for it was wavering in the 80s. I wonder if that had anything to do with the Reagan administration's, you know, staunch stance against the legal drug in the 80s. And with that, I'll open the discussion to international pressures, which will intervene, there's no question, to the Canadian decision. Should we be playing second fiddle to you know, our big American brother telling us we should, you know, go casually with this?
First of all, when you talk about international, it is only American opposition, because the rest of the Western world has changed. Look, I think we have to establish ourselves as a sovereign nation, but I'm also not a fool. I recognize that there will be some bad tie-ups at the border that will probably cost millions of dollars to the trucking industry. If I was a politician, not an activist, I might not elect to take the decriminalization route for fear of what the Americans can do. But you know what? We can't be afraid of them, and it's exactly the way the Germans responded to the Dutch. And eventually, they've decriminalized. And I know the United States will, well, I don't know that. They're a strange country. But if they're rational, they will follow suit eventually.
Derek, Jeff?
Yeah. Well, I would say that we're already shipping huge amounts of marijuana into the, and we, the liberal part. That's a terrible way to put it, but I would say, I mean, it's clear to the Americans and to Canadians that there are large, significant amounts of Canadian-grown marijuana being illegally smuggled into the U.S., illegally grown here and smuggled there.
It was either your report, sorry to interrupt, just to clarify that, it was either your report or the Senate report that said Canada produces about 800 tons of illicit cannabis each year, and about 60% of it, they say, is exported to the United States.
That's true. And when we went to we dropped into Washington and to New York to check out the lie of the land down there. And quite frankly, politically, federal legislators, federal bureaucrats are staying on message. You know, the White House has crafted the message, and that it's a total prohibition, a hard line drawn on drugs. And we were frank with them about where we thought we wanted to go, and the response wasn't, it wasn't that welcoming, but we were fairly firm, and we haven't lost any friendships, but the Republican side down there is staying on message and doesn't like the thought of Canada moving the goalposts in terms of decriminalization. That's not even to mention legalization. So it's
the Americans have really accelerated their propaganda campaign right now. It's unbelievable. I mean, suddenly studies are emerging from these obscure universities indicating brain damage and things of that nature, which we've been through 30, 40 years ago. So that's why I'm afraid of the Americans, because I see that they put a lot of money, even television ad campaigns, which we haven't seen for a decade, they're starting to put.
We've been seeing a lot of John Walters, who's the director of the White House Office National Drug Policy, and it's interesting that it's all coming. What do you think, Jeff?
Well,
do you think we should be succumbing to international, or shall I say American pressure to this debate?
Well, as a Canadian, obviously, of course not. You know, I mean, good grief. Although I'm down the States a fair bit, and I sit on an international certification board for addictions and enjoy my American colleagues. I guess my thoughts are, a few months ago I read a book called Slaying the Dragon. It's the history of alcohol and drug treatment in the U.S. And the what's and the drive. So if you like the abstinence and the harm reduction people, we're arguing in the mid-1700s. I closed the book and said, you know, not a heck of a lot's changed, okay? Yeah, I think that, you know, I struggle with a little bit, and perhaps you might be able to help me out on this, Derek, is when you sort of arbitrarily did, I'm not sure where the 30 grams came from. What was the rationale?
It's right in the CDSA right now.
Is it? Okay.
Under 30 grams is a summary conviction offense,
Right.
which is a non-fingerprintable offense.
Okay.
That's where it's coming from.
So that's where it's coming from. So there is a rationale for that. Well, see, I learned something here as well. And yeah, but it's...
We found that we're starting to argue it should be 30 grams or 25 or 17. Or,
Where do you draw the line?
And so someone had already created this 30-gram thing, which is about, you know, that much or something. And so
So it's an ounce, just over an ounce.
Yeah,
It's not
so,
a huge amount.
So we just went with 30. If
Okay.
someone likes the number 24 or 27, Frank Mahalovich's old number, that's great. It's just, you know, it doesn't matter, and it was more aggravating for us because, again, I think most of us viewed marijuana as a bit of a piker,
Right.
and it doesn't matter whether it's 30 or 35 or 25, just small amounts, and we're only dealing with possession,
Right.
not with trafficking. You want to traffic in 30 grams or less, our recommendations would recommend the law stay the same. It's trafficking.
And that's why eventually it has to be legalization, because it makes no sense to exonerate the person, the user, and
We're
then
not
the supplier.
exonerating. We're just unplugging that person from the
But
criminalized
it doesn't make a lot of
response.
sense to give them the option to do so, and that someone who supplies it then is criminalized. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And eventually we're going to have to
Or in
address that
particular
issue.
where you have medically prescribed marijuana. Then you got a real conundrum.
Well, we have age prohibition. I mean, you got to be a certain age to buy tobacco. You got to be a certain age to consume alcohol legally. If we have laws on, you know, if I sell as an adult, someone below the age of tobacco, I'm subject to some kind of sanction. So,
But we're going to have to regulate the sales to adults, because it's silly to have the 18-year-old who buys marijuana able to do so lawfully, and the person who sells them the few grams, they're not going to go to jail. But mind you, trafficking is an offense that does attract imprisonment.
Gentlemen, I hate to cut you off on that point because we are starting another interesting debate there, but I do have to wrap things up, and I'd like to finish it with a final question. We talked about marijuana now being in the criminalized system since, I think, the Opium Act of 1923, and we've talked about the Ledin Commission in 1973 putting forth you know, the first discussions about moving towards a decriminalized system. Here we are in 2003, and I think I've got the Justice Minister, Martin Cochon, on record as saying we will likely see something in 2003 with respect to a move towards decriminalizing marijuana. I'd like to get a sense from each of you as to whether that's going to happen before we get around to 2004. I'll begin with Derek.
I'm ready to go to work on a bill sponsored by the government decriminalizing possession of small amounts of marijuana, and I anticipate something before the end of the year myself. It wouldn't be passed into law for about 12 months. Could be 2004, but it would be my view that if we're going to do it, we've got to get it done before the end of the Parliament, which would be sometime in mid-late 2004. So yeah, I'm ready to go to work. Let's just put it that way.
Jeff?
well, I don't know if I can comment on that. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not there. I'm not elected. But I sure would hope that your government would also get on with other recommendations in that report. We need a strategy.
The money side, the strategy, yeah,
We need a
fully in
strategy.
agreement. In fact,
my real fear, Derek, is that you're going to move on that
Yeah.
because, okay, and not do the other stuff, okay, and we're going to cause some harm.
and it's so cosmetic. It really is, and I'm sure
That's the
you'll
point.
agree as
That's
well.
the point.
Alan, the final word is yours. Are
great.
you
By the way.
optimistic?
No,
You've been waiting for
First of all, I have
30
a
years.
pessimistic personality, so no, I think Cochon's playing a smoke and mirrors game. He will introduce something, as Derek mentioned. I just don't think it'll pass in time, and he gets the brownie points for introducing it, manages to tell the Americans we haven't done anything, tells Canadians going to election, elect our party, we're going to finish the job we started, and meanwhile nothing changes. And that's why I continue to sue the government over this issue and will maintain a litigation strategy, because I've lost faith in Parliament. And maybe you can...
I'm going to do my very best.
Gentlemen, it's a fascinating debate. So much, I think, has still been left unsaid, and we'll be hoping to touch on more of them as we continue with this program in the future. Alan, thank you so very much for joining us. Alan Young, Derek Lee,
Thank you,
Member of
Charles.
Parliament for Scarborough Rouge River, and Jeff Wilby. Thank you all so very much for joining us in this discussion, and thank you, the viewers at home, for taking part. If you'd like to get in touch with us, we'd always love to hear from our viewers. If you have any questions about the show or want to send us any feedback, please go to our website at www.marijuanadebate.ca. Please join us next time as we examine the research and medical findings connected with marijuana. I'm Charles Clement. Thanks for watching. See you next time.